Hello, this is the Linux Gamer, and I know this is another upload really quickly, but I felt like I could do some help for the KSP community by just making a very simple tutorial on how to orbit. Now, something I cannot stress enough is if you're starting in KSP, play Sandbox first. Do not start with Career. Since I started playing KSP before Career was introduced, I kind of had the advantage of knowing how the game and basic physics worked before I went around and started doing stuff with science and then eventually funds when those were implemented. So I've just got this sandbox save. Difficulty options are the same as normal, except I'm going to turn off stock vessels because that's just going to get in the way. By the way, on the topic of game modes, I would also recommend playing Science before Career Mode, because Career Mode, the difference between Career Mode and Science Mode is in Career Mode you have to worry about money and reputation, as well as research, and building upgrades, perhaps most importantly. The VAB and Launchpad upgrades in particular in early game are very limiting. Anyway, with that little discussion about game modes over, let's look at building your first rocket. Now, there is this tutorial you get, and it tells you the basics of how to build, which is very helpful if you don't know how to do that. But I'm just going to dismiss it and tell you how. To place the first part on your vessel, you just click the side. However, this isn't necessarily as much a tutorial for new players who don't even know how the game works as much as new players who just aren't sure how to get into orbit yet. Ignore that, that's a mod part. So I'm just going to start out with the most basic command pod, the Mark 1 command pod. It's this black one, although you can also make it white or white and gray. I like the classic black. Obviously, you're going to want a parachute on that. And then you don't really need a heat shield for returning from low Kerbin orbit, but it's good practice for later. And another thing about the heat shield that's good practice for later is Kerbal heat shields are absurdly overpowered. For low Kerbin orbit, you can shave off all the ablator for a return from the Mon. 40 to 60 on the 1.25 meter heat shield is plenty. For Duna and Eve, 80 to 100. You'll only really need 200 if you're coming back from Moho or Elu. Now here you need to learn to not repeat a mistake I did early in KSP. I knew about multi-stage rockets, but it didn't really occur to me that you need a decoupler to detach things. So let's attach a decoupler below that heat shield. So in flight we can use this to slice the command pod off the rocket. And then we need, obviously, propulsion. Now the best fuel, or the best basic stage for getting into orbit and beyond, in my opinion, is an FL T400 and this one, the Terrier engine. And I'm just going to change the variant because I like the truss mount version. Anyway, this stage is very powerful. That's at sea level delta V, which looks pretty weedy. But when you set it to vacuum, you see this thing has nearly 2,000 or over 2,000 meters per second of delta V, and I'll explain all this delta V stuff later if it's confusing. Anyway, this is where I went wrong when I was first building rockets. You need a decoupler to split stages. They don't just split automatically. And then, just so I can mention it, another mistake I made when I was starting, you don't actually need a fuel line to connect fuel tanks that are stacked together. They work just fine when they're stacked. They don't need a fuel line. Anyway, speaking of stacking, that's what I'm going to do. And then what you'd probably use in both in career mode and for simple sandbox rockets is this FLT 45. In fact, we don't need both these tanks because this is it's not exactly a fuel guzzler, and it's also not the most powerful thing, so we'd benefit more from having one tank. Anyway, this is saying delta V is 1241. It's going to be a little higher than that since it has significantly higher vacuum-specific impulse, which means it'll get more efficient as the atmosphere thins. Finally, you're going to want to put some fins on to help with steering. This engine has thrust vectoring, which means it can basically turn the nozzle to help point the rocket. But fins help, at least while you're in the atmosphere, with keeping the rocket oriented and steering, so I'm going to slap the Delta Deluxe on because I really like those. Anyway, here we have a very, very simple orbital rocket. So let's save it and launch it. Now, the question you probably came here to answer is, how exactly do you fly to orbit? It's not a matter of pointing straight up. I mean, that'll get you going fast, but it won't get you going fast in the right direction. Basically, when you're orbiting, you're falling at the ground, but you're falling so fast sideways that you just never hit the ground. Yeah, I'm not exactly a great explainer of physics, but basically when you're in orbit, you're throwing yourself at the ground and missing. I believe this definition is actually referenced in KSP itself in like some contract message. Anyway, a very helpful hotkey is Z to set the throttle all the way up, and then space to stage, so it'll activate this, and then the next time it'll activate that decoupler, and then the engine, and then that decoupler, and then the parachute, and so on. Basically, space just activates whatever's on the next one of these things. So we're going to take off. If your exhaust plume doesn't look the same as mine, don't panic. I have a visual mod that makes the exhaust plumes look a little more realistic. Anyway, as you can see, the thrust vectoring is working. We're deflecting the exhaust to steer. And you're going to want to tip over. Now, you're preferably going to want to tip over to the 90-degree mark because that's east, and Kerbin rotates eastwards, which means if you're going into an eastwards orbit, you've actually got a little bit of a boost from starting on a planet that is going eastward at about 100 meters per second, or, well, rotating eastward at 100 meters per second is what I'm trying to say. So you'll want to start pointing right on the nav ball for most orientations, but 90 degrees really is what that means. So east, as I was saying. You'll want to start pointing east on the nav ball. You don't want to tip over flat immediately because you need to get your altitude above 70 kilometers because that's where the atmosphere ends, and your orbit will decay if it remains in the atmosphere. Now, around 6 to 10 kilometers for beginners, I usually start a little lower, but 6 to 10 kilometers for beginners, you're going to want your craft to be pointing 45 degrees. Not this 45 degrees, that's northeast, but 45 degrees in that it's halfway between pointing directly up and the horizon. Another helpful thing is this button here, Maneuver Mode. That will tell you your apoapsis, which is your highest altitude above the ground, in this case sea level, and periapsis, which is your lowest, and that's negative because it's still inside the planet. Anyway, press space to discard that stage, and space again to light this Terrier engine. Now we're using the Terrier engine because it's a vacuum engine. It's far more efficient in thin air and in a vacuum, which is, well, where there's no air. On the other hand, that T-45 engine we had on the first stage has lower efficiency in vacuum but higher at sea level, and it's more powerful, so we need it to help lift the heavier bulk of that big fuel tank through the lower atmosphere. Anyway, you're going to want to be facing down around 15 to 20 degrees by the time you're at 20 kilometers. Don't tip down too aggressively, or you might actually run out of this time to apoapsis. You want this to be remaining steady or going up. It can go down a bit, like it just did there. If you're more than 30 seconds away, for instance, then you're probably safe. But you don't want that plummeting, because basically, if your time to apoapsis reaches 0, that means you're at apoapsis, which is your highest point, which means you're going to start falling. and you don't want to fall if you're going to space. Another helpful tip is these navigation things will allow you to point a direction. Prograde is the direction your ship is moving forward. In this case, we're not quite pointing prograde because the gravity of Kerbin has kind of pulled the direction vector down a little. I'm not going to point prograde yet because I still need my nose pointed up so that my time to apoapsis and my apoapsis continue to increase. Remember, the apoapsis and indeed the periapsis both need to be above 70 kilometers. Another helpful tip is you can use the comma key to slow down time. You can't, unfortunately, do slow-mo in vanilla KSP. Or you can use the period key to increase speed. While you're in an atmosphere, you can increase it 1, 2, 3, or 4 times. Well, 1 isn't an increase. And whoops, I wasn't paying attention, and now my apoapsis is way too high. That's another important lesson you need to learn in KSP. Orbital mechanics are very sensitive. We were going nearly orbital speed already, so instead of... basically, since we're going... Our prograde is almost on the horizon, that means prograde's going to start boosting the other side of the orbit to apoapsis. Okay, that was not a great or really understandable explanation, but point is, once you're in orbit, point prograde and the other... I guess the other side of your orbit will become the apoapsis and start getting higher. Anyway, you're going to want to wait until your time to apoapsis is about, for this case, 1 or 2, and then just press Z to get full throttle again. And when your periapsis gets above 70, congratulations, you are officially in orbit. You can press M to look at the map screen and confirm, yes, you are in fact in orbit. It's not very circular since, you know, Ascent hiccup. But that's how you get to orbit. And I might as well point out how you return to. The most efficient point to fire your return burn is at apoapsis, because to return you want to lower your periapsis, which is obviously on the other side of the orbit from apoapsis. Now you've been pointing prograde to speed up for this entire ascent. Now you want to slow down, so you point retrograde. And you don't actually have to hit the ground. Remember, Kerbin has an atmosphere that slows you down. So I usually drop the periapsis to around 30 kilometers. And now you can drop the fuel tank and the engine. You don't need them anymore. And then I would leave this set to retrograde since it helps with re-entry stability. One more helpful tip if you're coming over something that isn't water. This altimeter thing here is indicating sea level. If you want height over the terrain, you can click the waves and it'll switch to this mountain, and you can click to switch back, but the mountain tells you your altitude over the terrain. This is helpful when we get to landing. On other bodies, that is. Landing on Kerbin isn't hard because you will use a parachute 9 times out of 10. Anyway, you will see now the pod is catching fire. From low Kerbin orbit, this isn't a big deal, and also it's not exactly fire, it's plasma. It's from this thing called shock heating, where the craft is going so fast it compresses the air in front of it and causes it to heat up and form plasma. And now if you're coming in back from, say, the moon or Minmus or even another planet, this can start to become a problem, especially if you don't have heat shields. And it can actually destroy things. Anyway, it looks like we'll probably land in the ocean or maybe on the beach. Now you see this parachute is in a red box, so that means it can't be deployed yet, or if it does deploy, it'll be ripped, but by default, KSP doesn't allow the parachute to be deployed until the box is gray, and that means it's safe to deploy. So you can press the space bar to deploy the parachute. And then by default the parachute will open when you're 1 kilometer, so 1,000 meters above the terrain, and it's a little bit gradual, so don't be alarmed if you're still falling quickly. Now you've slowed down to 6 meters per second, so it'll take, okay, the numbers are moving too fast for me to really get a meaningful time, because by the time I've got it out of my mouth, it'll be like, well, 5 seconds closer because time warp, but that's neither here nor there. Point is, now you've landed, and now you can mouse over this and click Recover Vessel to recover your Brave Orbital Kerbal. Apparently, YouTube is also getting rid of poll cards, so leave in the description if you would like to see a continuation of this, perhaps simple guides to landing on other bodies, rendezvous, docking, interplanetary trips, you know, all that stuff. Thanks for watching, goodbye.